A warm welcome, everyone. I'm Charisse Louw, joining you from Cape Town. Thank you to the BSA New Materialisms study group, particularly Nick J. Fox, the BSA Death, Dying, Bereavement study group, and the Center for Socio-Digital Futures, especially Debbie Watson, for this invitation. I'm a researcher in African cinema at the University of Stellenbosch and a somatic facilitator. Today I want to invite us into grief work, not as a pathology, but as an embodied methodology. Through the film This Is Not a Burial, It's a Resurrection, directed by Lemogang Jeremiah Mosese in 2019, we'll move between African cosmologies, new materialisms, and my own concept of zombie methodology. As an opening gesture, I invite you into a brief somatic awareness. So just settle into your body and feel what your body needs. It might need movement, it might need stillness, and only you really can tell what your body needs. Something you are uniquely equipped to do is to feel your feelings, and yet, goodness, we try and avoid it at all costs. So let's collectively settle in, feel our sit bones on the chair, or if you're standing, your feet on the ground. You might want to place a hand on your heart and just feel your breath rising and falling. Another hand on the navel. In Qigong, we call this the one-wave breath. Feeling the breath rise from the belly up into the chest and then fall again. And as you settle in, you might notice feelings that have been long dormant, not all of which might be comfortable. So just making space for whatever arises, knowing that it will fall away. Perhaps you have sounds coming in. I can hear the birds and the distant sound of the ocean. Perhaps you can tap into the sound of your own breath as it rises and falls. The feeling of the breath moving in and out of the nostrils. Let's take a collective inhale deeply and sigh it out. So stay in touch with your felt experience throughout this presentation. And give yourself an opportunity to breathe and be with whatever's arising. So as introduction, I'll outline why we've gathered from all the corners of our precious planet. And since we're no doubt a mixed group, I'll also unpack briefly some of the concepts. So this is a two-part series in which I invite you into the cracks, which I've gleaned from Biokomolafe. These are unstable, often invisible spaces where dominant systems falter and speculative futures emerge. Drawing on African cinema, Black technopoetics, which is the reimagining of technology through Black expressive practices to resist racialized technoscience and invent new ways of being. Indigenous cosmologies, which in brief are relational worldviews that understand all beings, the more than human, the elemental, all are interconnected, animate, and participating in ongoing processes of creation and care. And somatic practice, an embodied approach to awareness and movement that cultivates sensitivity to the body's sensations, rhythms, and relations as sources of knowledge, healing, and transformation. I propose a zombie methodology, a way of thinking with collapse that is embodied, relational, and alive to the more than human. What gave rise to this series is I've been thinking about how zombies might offer a transdisciplinary hinge between grief work, decoloniality, and speculative futures. I'd love to co-create something that's not just academic, but also somatic, affective, and open to all. My hope is to create spaces where we can feel together through the entangled crises of now. This seminar will explore how diffractive methods, inspired by the physicist Karen Barad, and her notion of diffraction, which traces how phenomena interact and transform one another, reading across differences to generate new patterns of understanding rather than reflecting or comparing them. How this can interrupt extractive logics and generate new modes of inquiry at the intersection of art, ecology, and epistemology. So in the follow-up workshop, which is at the end of October, participants can engage with guided somatic practices, creative exercises, which attune us to both rapture and reworlding. Together we'll ask, how can we, in a moment of ecological collapse, systemic grief, and digital saturation, imagine differently? This is not a burial, it's a resurrection is an ecofeminist lament from the mountain kingdom of Lesotho, a small, landlocked country nestled within my homeland of South Africa. At its center, Mantoa, an 80-year-old widow who has buried her husband, her children, and at the start of the film, her last son who hasn't returned from the mines. At the start, she prepares for her own death, digging her grave, ready to join the ancestors. But then she learns that a dam will drown her village, not only the homes of the living, but also the graves of the dead, the placentas and umbilical cords buried in the soil, the ancestral flesh that binds the community to its land. To flood the village is to sever those ties, to unmake a world. From here, the land itself steps forward as protagonist. Nature isn't scenery but agent, womb and grave, grief and resistance. Through long takes, haunting narration, and spectral sound, director Mosese allows the earth to breathe, mourn, and remember. Mantoa's grief, at once intimate and collective, becomes a force of refusal. In her frail body, we glimpse an ecofeminist ethic of care, where mourning isn't weakness but power, where an elderly woman confronts both patriarchy and the god of progress. The film insists that matter is vibrant, that soil, stone, and bone are storied and alive. To resist the drowning of the land is to resist the erasure of memory, ancestry, and possibility itself. Recent scholarship in eco-cinema and ecological hermeneutics helps us read a film like This Is Not a Burial, It's a Resurrection in fresh and powerful ways. As Paskiewicz reminds us, cinema is an ecological medium. It does not simply show nature as background. It can draw attention to the fragility of ecosystems, the devastation caused by extractivist economies, and the possibilities for multi-species coexistence. When we watch Mantoa walk across the mountains, the landscape isn't scenery. It's a character, fragile, agentic, breathing. In Eco-Cinema Theory and Practice from 2023, they take this further. The book argues that film itself is only thinkable as permeable congregations of materials and energies, suffused by flows and affects coursing through the wider world. Cinema isn't separate from the ecological crises it depicts. It is materially entangled, from the minerals in the camera to the energy grids that power its projection. This resonates with Kajetan Iheke's idea of wild cinema, where African films narrate land depletion and repair. Mosese's film is precisely this, an African wild cinema, mourning depletion, conjuring repair. Anne Elvey brings yet another layer through her ecological feminist hermeneutics. She writes, "To read with earth is to be braided with matter, history, and word, entangled with intersecting ecological and social traumas that make a moral claim on me. Reading with the earth requires attentiveness to the cries of the land and the ancestors, as well as the violences of colonization. Taken together, These works insist that stories, whether biblical, cinematic, oral, they're always ecological. They are entanglements of matter, memory, and multi-species voices. When Mantoa refuses to leave her ancestral graves, she embodies precisely this ethic. Cinema as ecological medium, film as wild material entanglement, reading with the earth as braided grief and responsibility. Her lament isn't a metaphor but a cosmology, where the body, soil, and story are alive and demanding our response. Nature, as I've said, is not a background. It's a cosmological element, alive with change, transformation, and the presence of the ancestors. And this is not a burial, it's a resurrection. We feel this. Grasses whisper, mountains breathe, ancestors abide. Mosese filmed in a 4:3 ratio, that is not widescreen, to resist turning Lesotho's mountains into just picturesque scenery. Instead, the landscape itself becomes a character inseparable from the villages, and I've heard him say that the actors become a landscape. He draws on a beautiful Sesotho concept of Seriti. In Sesotho cosmology, Seriti isn't an aesthetic halo. It's the invisible life force, an emerging aura that makes matter and mattering possible. It knits mineral, plant, human, and ancestral beings into a vibrational coexistence. Seriti is the shadow or aura that shapes identity and dignity. A leader with strong Seriti affects the heart as much as the mind. Actress Mary Twala's face becomes a landscape of grief and poetry. Her body, luminous with Seriti, is as powerful as the mountains around her. The title, "This is not a burial, it's a resurrection," is drawn from Mosese's poetry. Walk into my mother's womb, walk into my morgue. He names the simultaneity of womb and grave, burial and resurrection. The film asks us not for neat endings, but to step into resonance, like entering a cathedral or a gallery, Mosese says, where every element, body, soil, breath, is storied and alive. In this sense, African cosmologies remind us, as Robin Wall Kimmerer of Braiding Sweetgrass fame says, that paying attention is a form of reciprocity. To watch this film attentively is already to enter relation with land, ancestors, and community, and to feel with Mantoa the weight of resisting erasure. South Africa's well-known concept of Ubuntu gives us a practice for repair. We become through each other. In this film, that each other includes the dead. Dignity appears as Seriti, a shaded radiance, binding bodies, soil, and ancestors. Grief, then, isn't inert. It's a somatic relation that can open altered states of responsibility, a positive mysticism discerned in community. This yields concrete ethics. Actions are right when they protect vitality and solidarity. A dam that drowns graves and fractures bonds fails both tests. We avoid nostalgia. Community without rights becomes oppression. And for a way forward, we have historical chief Mosese, who was the founding father of the Basotho nation, which is modern-day Lesotho, in the 1800s, and a visionary leader known for his diplomacy, wisdom, his commitment to peace. He reminds us that leadership can be luminous. These Sesotho concepts, boto, which means humanness or the quality of being truly human through relationship, as in Ubuntu, Seriti, this vital spiritual dignity, Chlompo, a deep recognition and respect for the more than human. These are a relational ontology central to Basotho cosmology that inculcate hospitality and care as power. In this light, Mantoa's ecofeminist lament is governance, a zombie methodology of staying with the dead as active matter, refusing erasure and reworlding from grief. Nina Licker, in Vibrant Death, a post-human phenomenology of mourning, proposes that death is not inert, but vibrant and entangled with life. She critiques Western philosophy's erasure of the mourner, noting that the short answer to the question of where the mourning I is located in Western philosophy is nowhere. Instead, she places the grieving subject at the center, arguing that the corpse and the mourner co-become within vibrant matter. Drawing on Spinoza and Jane Bennett, she affirms that if all matter is conative, vibrant, and striving to persevere, then this must apply not only to living bodies but also to dead ones. Mourning, in this view, becomes a practice of transcorporeal co-becoming, where the beloved's body becomes inhumanized as dust, earth, worms, or ashes, associated with a passionately transcorporeal material and post-human vibrancy. Sophie Strand similarly reworks grief and decay as fertile thresholds. She asks, what would it mean to claim fertility inside of decay, framing the body as porous, composting, and more than one? I think that there is such a push to get well, to fix the earth. It doesn't allow us to be present with where we're at. Acknowledging what we're losing is so important, says Strand. So for her, grief is not a state to be overcome, but an opening into ecological relationality. The mourner learns to live with rot as womb and with decomposition as creativity. Bayo Okumalafe reframes grief as a generative instability. Grief is generative, he says. She opens up things that were once bound up and secure, and therefore facilitates change. Maybe loss is also infected with becoming. So for Akomalafe, grief unsettles closures, making space for emergent solidarities and post-human futures. Together, these thinkers offer a radical ecology of grief. For Licker, mourning is a vibrant death, where the mourner co-becomes with matter and the beloved continues as more than human. For Strand, grief is compost, a decay that is doorway, fertile and porous. For Akomalafe, grief is generative mutiny, a disruption that births new solidarities. This synthesis dovetails with my zombie methodology. Grief isn't a resolution, but a haunting, an insistence on staying with the dead as active matter. In This Is Not a Burial, It's a Resurrection, Mantoa embodies precisely this. Her grief binds her to ancestors, to the soil, to the community. It refuses closure. She becomes a mourner who's also a medium, embodying Licker's transcorporeality, Strand's compost, and Akomalafe's generative instability. Life in capitalist ruins is still life. Precarity is the condition of our time, but also the site of emergent collaboration. Patchiness Alatsing et al. Shows how the Anthropocene is not homogeneous, but made of uneven, fragile, multi-species landscapes. Toxic worlding insists that these landscapes are chemically saturated, haunted by slow violence, and that there is no pure ground to return to. Humans must collectively rediscover arts of living that expand alliances beyond familiar solidarities and species boundaries, says Gijsler and Prince in their Toxic Worldings. Necropolitics grounds this in power. These toxic, patchy ecologies are also death worlds, structured by racial capitalism and colonial violence, where some populations are rendered disposable, as we're watching happen in real time. These cosmologies are not only on screen. Across Southern Africa, communities defend land as ancestor, resisting extractivism. Here, grief is political. Mourning destroyed ecologies, refusing mining and damning futures, insisting that everything is a being. In Lesotho, women displaced by the Highlands Water Project have led resistance. On South Africa's wild coast, neighbouring Lesotho, the Amapondos say everything is a being. For them, storms and surging seas are ancestors speaking. This was the spirits of the ancestors bringing a message to the people, using the vocabulary of the elements. Their fight against titanium mining and seismic blasting is intergenerational, carried by the same spirit of resistance that fueled their uprising against apartheid in the 1950s. On the west coast of South Africa, the Tama people and the coalition Protect the West Coast have joined with surfers, scientists, and fishers to resist diamond and sand mining. One elder said they didn't just steal our land, they stole our identity, our language, and our traditions, but we will get them back. Another community voice put it quite starkly: we are a slave on our own ground. Through social media campaigns, legal battles, and new tools for democratic participation, they've actually stopped mining at the Olifants River mouth and carved out spaces for justice. These movements teach us that resistance is more than protest, it's cosmological. The Amapondo fight because the land is alive with ancestors. The Tama fight because dispossession was also a theft of language, dignity, and belonging. In Lesotho, where our film is set, women fight because displacement erases their graves, livelihood, and futures. Mosese places Mantoa in this lineage. Her refusal to leave her ancestors' grave resonates with these activists' refusal to abandon their lands. Her grief becomes governance, her lament an ethic of care. Watching her on screen prepares us to recognize these living struggles off screen, where land, dignity, and cosmology are at stake. Gijsler and Prince warn, there is no return to purity. Instead, we must learn to live with toxicity, forming new alliances. This is where Griefwork and zombie methodology converge. They teach us to live with, to reworld from ruins. In the film, the preparations for Mantoa's burial are not just personal. Her weary, grieving body becomes a threshold between human and land, between life and death. She's already halfway gone, yet she refuses erasure. She embodies the liminality of grief itself. During my fellowship at the Center for Socio-Digital Futures at Bristol University, I developed a zombie methodology, an embodied, relational, affective response to collapse. Zombies are unfinished bodies, neither alive nor dead, both haunted and haunting. They are what refuses to die. Sarah Juliet Laura reminds us in The Transatlantic Zombie that the zombie emerges from slavery and colonialism as a figure of social death, a body alive but unfree, animated by histories of violence that cannot be laid to rest. The zombie, she writes, is the return of the oppressed, the persistence of that which power attempts to kill off but cannot. Like grief, zombies resist closure. They keep us in the ruins, asking us to compost with decay rather than rush towards repair or redemption. This is an ethic of staying with, of letting the dead remain active matter in the present. In Mosese's film, the collective funeral becomes a kind of zombie body. The village itself is suspended between past and future, grieving together in a state of unfinishedness. Their lament is not only for the dead, but for the land, for the graves, for the ancestral ties threatened by the dam. In this sense, the funeral is both mourning and resistance, a communal refusal to let the village be buried without resurrection. There'll be more on this on the workshop on October the 27th, also free but requiring registration through the BSA. I want to leave us with a provocation. What might it mean to practice grief not as endpoint, but as methodology? And what might it mean to practice futures, which emerge if we move more like zombies, porous and finished, entangled with the dead and the earth? So as a closing gesture, I invite you to once again place a hand on your heart. Feel your breath moving. Maybe close your eyes as you feel the words and images percolate through your porous being. And feel the many griefs of the current moment rising and falling in you and through you, resonating. And let's just bring a soft smile to the corners of the mouth. And take a deep inhale and sigh it out. Thank you so much.